So, okay, so we are continuing in our studies, just looking at the various women in the Bible. And so far, we've looked at the stories of Sarah, of Tamar, of Rahab. And today, we are looking at the story of Ruth. And I'm hoping that the last couple of weeks, we looked at characters, Tamar and Rahab, who were not as familiar with some people, although Rahab a little bit more because of the story of Jericho. Tamar was unusual. But then as we continue on, as we look at the story of Ruth and Esther, well, these are characters that are much more common and well known. So you'll probably be much more familiar with these stories as we look at it. Also, the fact that Ruth has her own book, right? And so there are two books in the Bible that are that's named after women, and those are, of course, Ruth and Esther. Next week we'll be looking at the story of Esther, and so today we look at the story of Ruth. Beginning, let's see, get this to work. There we go. So just like last time, when we looked at the story of Rahab, Ruth is another woman that is listed in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1. As you can see in this slide, where it kind of lists the genealogies as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1, verse 6, or chapter 1. Ruth is listed in there. I kind of boldface that. The mother of Obed. And so we'll see how in this story, how she comes about being included in this genealogy and how she becomes a part of the heritage of Jesus. Ruth is an interesting character because just like all the other women in the that's listed in the genealogy of Jesus, they have an interesting history. As we looked at Tamar, she was one who kind of had to devise her own way, kind of trick Judah, one of the sons of Jacob, to pretty much having a child with her. And then Rahab was actually a prostitute in the city of Jericho that the Israelites come in and conquer when they entered into the promised land. And so Rahab was not an Israelite at all. She was a Canaanite, and yet she becomes part of the genealogy of Jesus. She and her whole family become, in a way, adopted into the Jewish community. And today we look at Ruth, who is also a foreigner. So it's interesting because much of when we look at a lot of the Jewish traditions, and especially the way the Israelites interacted with people outside of the people of Israel, there's always this sense that I found this on the web. Sorry, my watch is telling me about Jewish beliefs and practices. I get those watches that kind of talk back to you. So when we look at the Israelite tradition, the Jewish traditions, they a lot of times we kind of see them as the practices or the laws of Moses that kind of enforce that the people of Israel kind of stick to themselves. Whenever they entered into a new territory, they would push out all the other people, the foreigners. And so again, last week when we looked at the story of Rahab, when the Israelites entered into the promised land and went to the first city of Jericho, the mandate that that was given to them was to kill everyone, demolish everything, and that the Israelites would just come in, and so that the whole idea was that you wouldn't have this intermixing of culture and for the most part intermixing of faith, beliefs, religion. And yet, what you see here in these genealogies,
8:30 tomorrow morning.
I should pick it up. Okay. Okay.
let me see if I can control some of the muting here. Sorry, I have no control here. There it is. Chat. Is this everyone? Okay. All right. There you go. So then when we get into, so again, as we look at the culture of Judaism, where they were pretty much what we read in the book of the Old Testament, where the Israelites were kind of promoted to stick to themselves, a lot of that was given to them, or it was actually a product of teachings that arise after the Babylonian exile in 586 BC, and primarily because the Israelites, the Jewish people at that time, felt that the reason why they were conquered by the Babylonians is because they interacted and they allowed their faith religion of Israel to become tainted, or to become influenced by other religions. That teaching kind of gives the idea that the Israelites were supposed to just stay within themselves. However, again, going back here, when we look at the genealogy of Jesus, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, they were all actually people that were not part of the Israelite heritage. They actually were foreigners. Although, as we look at the story of Ruth, she's actually has some blood relation. So let's look at this. Let's first of all look at the book of Ruth. So the book of Ruth is in the Old Testament, and it's placed after between the book of Judges and First Samuel in our Christian Bible. Now, the interesting about our Christian Old Testament is that it's the same Bible as the Hebrew Bible, what the Jewish faith use as the Hebrew Bible, except the books are rearranged differently. For us, it's the book of Ruth. The story of Ruth is in the early part of the Old Testament, and it reads almost as a historical account, because the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are what we call the books of the law, the Torah. And then after that, you have a set of books that are what we call historical books and books of the prophets, that kind of gives a historical account of what happened in the history of Israel. And Ruth is right there, right after the story of Joshua conquering the promised land, and then Judges, the time of the Judges, and after Joshua, and then before the books of Samuel, which starts telling us about the anointing of the first kings, the monarchy of Israel. Ruth is kind of wedged right in there. And so it kind of reads as a historical account rather than just a literary work. In the Hebrew Bible, on the other hand, it's part of what is known as the Ketuvim, which is the third part of the Bible. The Hebrew Bible is broken into 3 parts. The first part, again, same first 5 books of the Old Testament, called the Torah, or the Pentateuch. The second part of the Hebrew Bible is called the prophets, and that's where, like I said, is majority of the historical and the writings of all the prophets. So all the prophets from the books of Samuel, Kings, that's the historical. You also then have the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and all the minor prophets. That's all clumped together. And then there's a third part of the Bible, which is called the Ketuvim, the writings. And these writings contain what we would have as the book of Psalms, the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. And on Tuesday nights, we're going over the wisdom literature. And so the wisdom literature that we're looking at is Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the book of Job. In our Christian Bible, the book of Job is actually pushed all the way in front, next to the book of Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah. But those books also in the Hebrew Bible are actually put in the third section. And that third section called Ketuvim, or like I said, more it's translated as writings, as in poetic writings, as literary writings. In other words, they're not necessarily historical. They're writings that teach us about whether it be the culture of Israel, as we looked at last time. You know, all of the Bible is to teach us about, you know, there's a theological aspect to it, to teach us who is God and who we are, you know, and how do we relate with God. That's the major crux of the theological teachings of the Bible. But it's taught through laws, history, and these writings. And so the writings in the Ketuvim are more poetic language. Well, Ruth is part of that third section in the Hebrew Bible. So these are stories and writings, not necessarily historical. And for the book of Ruth, it's actually one of 5 books in the Old Testament that are read every year in certain Jewish festivals. And so in the Jewish history, there are 5 festivals or high holy days in the Jewish calendar. For us as Christians, we have Christmas, we have Easter, right? We do have Pentecost, and we do have, you know, some other dates that aren't as high and holy. But in the Jewish tradition, there are 5 festivals that are very important. And there are other holidays too, like Rosh Hashanah and so forth. But of the 5 days, one of them is the Festival of Shabbat, which is what we would consider as being Pentecost. And it's during the Pentecost season. It's 50 days after Easter for us. In the Jewish tradition, it's 50 days after Passover. And so 50 days after Passover is what they would call Shabbat or Pentecost. And what they celebrate is the observance of giving thanks to God for the harvest. And during that festival, that high holy observance of Shabbat, in the synagogues and in the temple, the Jewish tradition is always read the book of Ruth, all 4 chapters, in a singular seating during the festival. And so they read the story of Ruth every year, and this story is reminded of them. And so the question is, okay, so what is the teachings? And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So, well, one of the teachings, moral teachings, is about loyalty and about caring, but there's more to that than that. So let's continue on. So in terms of the dating and the authorship of the book of Ruth, as I mentioned, it's part of the third section of the Ketuvim, the Hebrew Bible, which also means that even though in the Christian, our Old Testament, we put it in the historical section, it was written much, much later. Most likely it was written around, let's see, traditionally people say that it was written during the time of Samuel by the court, the monarchy, the courts around 1000 BC, but most likely it was written post-exile. It was actually written after that exilic period. And again, if you hear anything from the Bible studies that Dr. Bill and I teach, everything in the Hebrew, in the Jewish tradition, evolves around that exilic period, that time of the exile when Babylon came in and destroyed the temple and took the remnants of Israel captives into Babylon, and for about 50 plus years, from 586 BC to 539, that was well, how can I say it? A traumatic period. That was a period that shaped the Jewish faith and the people of Israel. You know, a lot of times when we read the Old Testament story, we think it's the story of the Exodus when the Israelites came out of Egypt, that they became this people of you know, the Jewish people. Yes, that's part of their history, but it was in terms of the theology and the teachings of Judaism, that was all formulated after or because of or during the time of the exile in 6th century BC. So most modern scholars would say that this was written around that time. And the significance of this teachings of the book of Ruth is not the moral teachings that we think of as just, you know, be nice and be kind, which we will go through the story, but it actually has to do with how we treat others, especially foreigners, and the whole understanding of inclusivism versus exclusivism. We get into this topic here. Anyhow, so let's get into the story of Ruth. And it's 4 short chapters in the Old Testament. So hopefully many of you have had a chance to read through this. So Ruth, who is Ruth? So Ruth, it begins, you know, chapter 1 of Ruth talks about that Ruth was actually a foreigner. She was a Moabite, and she is the daughter-in-law of Naomi. Now, the story goes, let me click in here. Okay, here you go. The prologue, that Elimelech, who was Naomi's husband, and Naomi, they were from the tribe of Judah, and they lived in Bethlehem. So you can see on that little map, there's Judah, which is the southern part of the kingdom of Israel. And there's no real date of when this would have been, except for the fact that because of the genealogy of Jesus, we can place them somewhere in the, it would have been sometime during the what would it be? 1200, 1100 or 1200 BC, somewhere around there. So Elimelech was Naomi's husband. The two of them, they moved from their home in Bethlehem to Moab, which is across the Dead Sea to the other side because of a famine. And if you remember the story of Abraham back in the book of Genesis, when Abraham and Sarah and they brought along with them, when they moved over, they brought along with them their nephew Lot. Remember that story? So Abraham and Sarah and their nephew Lot, when they came down to this area of Canaan, they looked upon all the land, and upon all the land, they realized that the land east of the Dead Sea or east of the Jordan River was much more lush. It was very green. And so Lot decides, you know what, I'm going to go that direction, you know, towards east of the Dead Sea to settle down. And that becomes basically where Lot settled. But for Abraham and Sarah, they they heard God's call to be on the west side, because that was considered to be what they believed would be the promised land. So they settled, you know, on the west side of the Dead Sea, whereas Lot settled on the east side of the Dead Sea. And from there, that's where the story goes. Now, who are the Moabs? This is what the next thing is. Okay, so the Moabs. So again, like I said, Moab was a fertile highlands east of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. And well, before I get to the story of Elimelech, the people of Moabite, they were, so then what happened with Lot is that after he went over to Moab, and if you remember some of the Genesis story, Lot is mentioned in one very significant account. There was a story where Abraham, God is talking to Abraham and talking about, oh, there's all these cities and nations or people that were living unrighteous lives, put it that way. And one of the names of, well, two of those cities were called Sodom and Gomorrah. You guys know the story, right? And that God was going to destroy those cities because of their sinfulness. And of course, that there's a story in Genesis 20 where God kind of tries to negotiate with, or Abraham tries to negotiate with God, saying, well, are you going to destroy all those people even if there's maybe 50 people that are righteous in that city? And God said, okay, fine. If you can find 50 righteous people, then I won't destroy the city. And Abraham says, well, okay, maybe not 50. How about 40? You know, and then he goes down, right? And so, well, maybe not 40, but 20. And God keeps saying, right, fine. You know, if you can find 20 good people there, then I won't destroy the city. And he finally, you know, Abraham finally negotiates down to, if there's 10 people that's good in that city, you know, God won't destroy it. Unfortunately, you know, the story goes that he couldn't find anyone, and those cities are destroyed. Well, one of those cities was where Lot and his family, he had a wife and he had a couple of daughters, and that's where they lived. And so then, you know, God tells Abraham to take, you know, or tells Lot to, you know, escape from that city. And we all know the story, right? As they're running away, they're told, don't look back on the city while it's being destroyed. And who turns around? Lot's wife, and she turns into a pillar of salt, right? So we have that story. So that's all the way in Genesis. And so Lot and his daughters escape Sodom and Gomorrah, and they end up settling in Moab, in the land of Moab. Now, there weren't people, or there may have been people there, but they weren't called Moabites at that time. The people of Moabites come about through the lineage of Lot. Lot, in realizing that, okay, he just lost his wife, he has two daughters, but then again, the feeling is that they were supposed to only marry within the bloodline, or the what do you call it? Within the family. Realized the only way to propagate the lineage was to bear children through his daughters. And so the people of Moabite were actually a people that came about from the incestuous relationship between Lot and his oldest daughter. Yich, right? Well, what can we say? You know, it was a long time ago, but that's what they were. So ever since then, this whole Moabites were given a really bad name, or very bad reputation, because it's like, oh yeah, they were children of Lot through his oldest daughter, and that's how the people of Moab began. Okay, that's the history of Moab. So when Elimelech and Naomi move over to Moab, they are surrounded by people of Moabites. And in time, Elimelech dies, but then they have two children. So Naomi and Elimelech had two sons by the name of Chilion and Malone. Malone marries a Moabite by the name of Orpah, and Chilion marries a Moabite by the name of Ruth. So Ruth is a Moabite, and so is Orpah, not Oprah, but Orpah. So yeah, I know. If you look at that, it's like Oprah, right? No. So Malone and Chilion each take on Moabite women to be their wives. So they just kind of settle in. And again, this whole idea that you're not supposed to marry foreigners, well, you know, all along in Jewish history, they're just settling and they're marrying. So that whole concept of don't engage with foreigners actually is a later theology that sometimes get pushed in. But then if you look at the history, it's always been there. The Moabites, again, this is what I talked about, right? The Moabites descended from Lot through incest. Yeah. Okay, so anyhow, over time, Malone and Chilion die. And it's interesting, the names of Malone and Chilion actually means the sickly and the weakness. Malone means sickly, Chilion means weakness. And during their time that Naomi and her sons and her husband were living in Moab, Naomi loses her husband, Elimelech dies, and her two sons, Malone and Chilion. And all she has with her now is her two daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth. And so then, let's see, there you go. Naomi, in her grief, she's in a foreign land. She has two daughter-in-laws, but what can back then in those times, what can women do to survive, to sustain themselves? Not much. Again, in a very patriarchal society, they relied upon the men, and the men having work, and they're the one that supported the wives. Even the most likely the women worked as well. They couldn't own anything, and so their livelihood depended on the men, whether it be their husbands or their fathers or their sons. That's what they depended on. And so with all the men in Naomi's life having passed away, Naomi, in her grief, she actually says in chapter 1, verse 20, she says, call me no longer Naomi. The name Naomi actually means pleasant, to be happy. The name Naomi means to be pleasant, but then she says, call me no longer Naomi, but call me Mara, M-A-R-A, which means bitter, that her life is no longer pleasant, that her life is now full of hardship. It's interesting, as we were reading this, right after our Tuesday evening class that talks about the story of Job and the struggles of life. Much of the Bible stories are about struggles of life and finding hope and looking to God for that hope. And that's what this story is we're going to get to. So Naomi then says to her two daughters, Orpah and Ruth, you know what? I have nothing now. I cannot give you, I don't have any more sons in my womb to offer you. So why don't you just go back home to your father's home? Which is also a very awkward suggestion, because once a daughter marries into someone else's home, they are no longer the daughters of their father. And yet, that's what Naomi is saying. That's how devastated she was. There was no other hope. Even that, to suggest that it's wrong, but there was nothing else that she could offer. And so she tells Orpah and Ruth to just go back to their father's home, and hopefully their fathers will have compassion on them and receive them back. And Orpah, they cry, and Orpah leaves, goes back to her home or somewhere, we don't know. But Ruth, and this is a famous line that she says, Ruth responds to Naomi and says, do not press me to leave you or to turn back from you, turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. Almost sounds like a wedding vow, doesn't it? Until death do us part. That's even more, that's better than a wedding vow. Just, so Ruth basically says to Naomi, my complete dedication is to, I'm your daughter-in-law, and we have nothing, but I will follow you and I will be with you. And in that sense, what Ruth is exhibiting here is a sense or a level of commitment and a level of just a relationship that kind of questions and tests, like, okay, what is she hoping to get with Naomi? Naomi has nothing, and there is no future. At least if she went back to her father's house, her father could have compassion on her and she could eat and whatnot, but they have nothing. And Ruth and Naomi is basically saying, I have nothing. I'm going to just go back home to my hometown in Bethlehem, and hopefully, the people there will have compassion on me. Well, actually, there is actually a Jewish law that has provisions for those who are widows and those who are desolate. And Naomi is kind of relying upon those laws to sustain her. But it wasn't there was no hope of prosperity or anything of that sort. It was just that at least if I go back to my hometown, based upon the Mosaic Law, I will be able to at least survive. And so that's what she says. And Ruth says, well, I'm going with you. So when they go back, again, the law that I was referring to is there's law on gleaning in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 to 21. And this is what it says. This is the Mosaic Law. When you reap your harvest in your fields, this is to the Israelites. So when they reap their harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. So why is that law so important? Well, what that law is saying, instead of and the Israelite laws, the Mosaic laws, actually has certain stipulations that really care for not just the people of Israel, but there's a much broader sense of compassion. And again, as I said, a lot of times when we think about the Jewish religion, it's only for the Jewish people, and they're very much a closed community, and yet the laws were much broader. And here it says, if you forget something, if you drop something, don't go back like, oh, I forgot that. That's mine. I need to go and get it because that's mine. The law says no. If you drop something, leave it, because someone else can benefit from it. Someone can use that. And so, in terms of gleaning the harvest, part of the Jewish the Mosaic Law is that you're not to harvest your field to its very last grain or to its very last. Don't bring in these huge industrial machines to get every single grain as possible to maximize your profit. No, it was to allow for things to be left behind for the purpose of allowing for those aliens, orphans, widows to be able to go get things for themselves. What do you guys think about that? You guys can unmute if you want. I want to hear. What do you think about that law?
It's caring for them.
It's caring for them. Right. There's this natural sense of compassion, right? It's built into the Mosaic Law to have that, think about the other person.
Might tie into immigration.
It does. We'll actually talk about that. Yeah.
The food share program in Camarillo does have a group of gleaners that go to the tomatoes, fields, celery, parsley, the berries, the fruit on, lemon and citrus trees, and that goes to the food share.
I do that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, food share is a wonderful program or organization that we have in Ventura County for the purpose of exactly what you said. That's right, because I know, like Hillary Ling, he has a huge orchard of a bunch of stuff. He's not going to eat all those oranges, and I know he has more oranges than he knows what to do with. He brings it to the church. He tried to give everyone away. He'll pay people to take it away. But again, if it weren't for food share, because food share comes and takes all that and gives it to people who need them, right? In a way, it's to balance that sense of the haves and the haves not. So much of our world, so much of our nation is so imbalanced between the haves and the haves not. And a law like this is stipulated to say, if you have, don't go around trying to accumulate as much as you can. What's the, after having read Ecclesiastes 2 weeks ago, what's the purpose of that, right? The more you have doesn't make you any happier. Right?
I think it's interesting that the concept of gleaning coming from the Old Testament is still part of our lives today. And
Right.
so much of what we make decisions on for community service or caring really go back.
Mm-hmm.
And we think we're so good.
Right. There's still a lot to learn from history and the past that we haven't quite mastered yet, figured it out yet. But yeah, there's a lot of wisdom back then. The other thing about this Mosaic Law is that, again, it's not where you harvest everything and then you give away, part of it to charity. It's not that. That's not how it works. What does it do? It allows for the aliens and the widows and those who are in need to be able to come and pick what they need.
So they work for it.
Yes, it's not just
Given.
It's different than just almsgiving, right?
Mhm.
It allows them to work for it.
And gives them a worth.
And what does that do? The fact that if they were to come and pick for themselves what they need versus just giving them what they need.
It gives them self-worth.
Self-worth. There's a sense of dignity.
Yes.
There? Yeah. So that's how this Mosaic Law works. That it's yes, it is a law of compassion, but the depth of the compassion is more than just okay. So it's a law to provide for those who are in need. It's even more than that. It's to provide for those in need, not only in the physical sense, but also in the holistic, physical, the spiritual sense. So that they work for it. So then, continuing with the story, so Ruth goes and starts gleaning on this land. And she didn't know whose land it was. She just happened to be gleaning on this land. And the owner of the land was this man named Boaz. Okay. And so then Boaz, so here's a scripture in chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. Now, Naomi, so the mother-in-law, had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Okay, you hear this, and again, like I said, the book of Ruth, even though it's in the Christian Bible, it's in the historical section. In the Hebrew Bible, it's in the writing section or the literary section, right? Or the story section. When you read this and it has this, now Naomi, had a kinsman, blah, blah, blah. And then, as it happened, those words, as it happened, it's almost like a storytelling, right? And the fact that it just so happened that Ruth that went over to glean on this field just so happened to be the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. Now, what does that mean? The fact that it just so happened. In one sense, you can say, oh, great fortune, right? Well, who would say that Naomi and Ruth had great fortune in their lives, right? The story started off by saying, well, they lost everything. Fortune, luck was not in their favor. And yet, as it says, or as it happened, that she just happened to be upon a land that was of a relative, it's something that's more than just coincidence. And what the story is trying to kind of paint the picture here is maybe there's some divine blessing that's happening in this story, right? Not coercive. God's not just saying, oh, you know what, Naomi, Ruth, they need something, so boom, here it is. But there is some guidance that's happening along. Do you guys kind of get that? Kind of hear that? So it just so happens that she happens to be upon this next of kin or this relative. It's a relative, which is great. But then, Ruth meets Boaz. Boaz comes and meets Ruth, and for some reason, she kind of he has a liking for her or whatnot, and he promises her, he kind of offers her protection and hospitality. So then, when Ruth saw Boaz, she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" Again, she's a foreigner. So that's being pointed out here, that she's a foreigner. She's an alien in the land. She doesn't expect anyone to give her any extra, favors. And so she said, why? How have I found favor? For I am a foreigner. But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband had been fully told me. How you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." So Boaz apparently has heard about Ruth and Naomi. So even though she just so happened to come to his field, Boaz's field, and started gleaning, behind the workers, Boaz may have cited her and said, "Oh, who is she?" And kind of did his own little investigative research, heard the story that, okay, one, she is a widow, so she's not a virgin, right? She's a widow, so then okay, so she's been married before. She lost her husband. He knows about that. He knows about who her family is. So Boaz knows that Naomi is a relative. That through Elimelech is a relative, and through the blood through marriage, that Naomi is a relative, and then of course Ruth is a relative. So he knows that, and so he offers them some compassion. But the way he said it is, because what you have done in showing your faithfulness, and because of your commitment to Naomi, your mother-in-law, may a blessing come upon you as well. That's what he's saying. Okay, so it's not quite like because she is good that he's been good to her, but he is saying that because of her acts of kindness and her acts of commitment, may such blessings then also fall upon her. And that's what he's saying. So then she goes back. After that, Ruth goes back home with whatever grains that she picked. And Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Now, Naomi doesn't know anything, right? This is just Okay, for Naomi, it's like she doesn't know, whose land that Ruth might have been working under. And Ruth says, the name of the man with whom I worked today is Boaz. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living and the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kinsmen. So again, here you have this almost like the story of, is this a coincidence? Or is there a hand of guidance that's happening here? And so she rejoices and she says, blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi is giving thanks. She's praising God, but giving thanks and blessing, acknowledging that the blessing comes to those who show kindness. I'm realizing the time, so I'm going to talk a little faster now. So Naomi meets Boaz, finds protection, and then Naomi starts in chapter 3, starts devising a plan for matchmaking. And I'll read it real quickly. Naomi says after a while, Naomi says to Ruth, my daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. Now, here is your kinsman, Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now, wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. And he will tell you what to do. She said to her, all that you say, I will do. Now, I'm assuming that you guys are all adults here and know exactly what's going on. Yes? Nods? No? I don't need to go into detail, right? Naomi is basically telling Ruth, go into his bedroom. Uncovering the feet is not just feet, okay? There's a bigger definition to that. You understand the connotation? Yes? Okay. At least Patty's nodding away with me. Thank you. All right, so I don't have to get into the details. In one sense, it sounds like, is Ruth or is Naomi trafficking Ruth, telling Ruth, go, sexually seduce Boaz? In one sense, that's what it sounds like, doesn't it? And yet, there's something about this that is actually well, I guess you could call it a blessing or there's actually here. Even though often, Naomi is seen as manipulating and taking advantage of Ruth and Ruth, what she's actually doing in this sense is actually arranging it in a way that both the needs of Ruth and Boaz are being met. And then what's interesting here is, in this situation, you would think that, oh, Boaz, this rich young fellow, and actually not young. Most scholars think that Boaz is the age of Naomi, that he's a relative of Elimelech, was probably a cousin of Elimelech, so would have been much older. And so, but you would think, okay, so then you have this man, very successful, rich, has everything he needs, and he's, through his compassion, he's taking care of Ruth, and Ruth is just a beneficiary of all that. So then for Ruth to go and kind of seduce Boaz, you kind of see this as being, that Ruth is taking advantage of Boaz, or Naomi telling Ruth to take advantage of Boaz. But a lot of scholars have questioned this and said, well, there's something about the story doesn't quite make sense. And what a lot of scholars have pointed out is, why would Boaz be unmarried at this point? For all accounts, Boaz would have been in his middle age And if he is so rich and he is so successful, and if he is so much an eligible bachelor, why wasn't he already married? And a lot of speculation is that, well, we don't know, but there was something. There was something about him that was a drawback, was a limitation, something about him that maybe he wasn't that eligible bachelor that we kind of imagine him to be. You know, when I first read the book of Ruth, I thought of like, oh, you know, Pretty Woman, that movie, you know, with Richard Gere and Julia Roberts, right? Richard Gere had everything. And yet in that story, you guys all seen the movie, right? Is that only? Yeah, you guys seen the movie. So, but in that movie, even though Richard Gere, you know, was this rich, you know, entrepreneur, and he had everything, and Julia Roberts was the prostitute, you know, and of course it seems like Richard Gere is saving Julia Roberts. In the end, you actually see Richard Gere changing because of Julia Roberts, right? His practice of his business, it changes. So there was something, again, in that movie as well, there was something that Richard Gere needed to learn. And in here, in this story, the understanding is that even Boaz had something that was his hindrance, that he struggled with. And through this convoluted way of meeting and Ruth entering into his life and Naomi entering into his life, that kind of gets, you know, they're able to come together. There is a little chapter 3, it gets a little complicated because apparently Boaz was not the direct next of kin to Elimelech. There was actually someone else. There was another a closer relative who was called the Kinsman Redeemer, and there's this challenge that technically that Kinsman Redeemer, according to that Levirate law, the law that we kind of looked at when we looked at the story of Tamar, where the brother or the next kinsman is supposed to marry the spouse or the wife of a dead brother or so forth. Apparently there was someone like that, a kinsman redeemer. It doesn't say who his name was, but Boaz ends up challenging that person so that person reneges his right to take Ruth as his wife, so that Boaz ends up marrying Ruth. Now, why is that chapter so important? It just kind of shows that the extent that Boaz was willing to go and marry Ruth. It wasn't that, again, that Ruth was taking advantage of Boaz, but after a while, Boaz also needed Ruth. And so, again, kind of wrapping up, the story goes, Boaz marries Ruth. Boaz fulfills his duty as the next kinsman redeemer. And then Ruth gives birth to a son, Obed. Obed is born, who becomes the father of Jesse, and Jesse becomes the father of King David. So it's very much, so it has to be around 1100 BC. So things kind of end with this, oh, happy ending, right? Obed is given, but then in chapter 4, as it concludes the story of Ruth, there's something very important that comes out. It says that Obed is given to Naomi to continue Elimelech's lineage. So again, remember the Levirate law, where when a child is born, it goes to the elder son's, lineage. Well, when Obed is born, even though it's Ruth and Boaz, that child is actually offered onto Naomi to be part of the lineage of Elimelech. And so it says, so Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. When they came together and the Lord made her conceive and she bore a son, then the women of the city said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him, Obed. So this whole story of Ruth is a story of commitment and committing and having compassion for one another. In the Hebrew or in the Hebrew language, there's a word called chesed. Okay, the story of Ruth is all about this message of chesed. Now, what is chesed? Chesed in English, there's no direct translation. In fact, scholars try to find a direct translation. There is none. Often it gets translated as loving kindness. Okay, so if you're lovingly kind to someone, is that chesed? Well, no, it just quite doesn't get it. What does it mean to be kind, and what does it mean to just be nice, right? Sometimes we're nice to people, and sure, we're nice to people just because it makes us feel good or because we feel like, well, that's our responsibility. Well, chesed is a lot more than that. What chesed is actually God's steadfast faithfulness, and it's an understanding of a lot of times the word chesed is to describe God's compassion for humanity, which brings about our redemption. This type of compassion is it's not pity, or it's not feeling sorry, and it's not just being nice or being kind just for the sake of being nice. It's a sense of deep love or compassion that brings about redemption, that brings about a sense of hope that would not be there. And so the story of Ruth is that through the story, in fact, the whole story of Ruth has layers of how this message of God's chesed, this God's steadfast faithfulness, kind of has run through the story of Ruth and Naomi. The first is when, again, the story starts off with Naomi being in that desolation, has lost everything, has lost her husband, has lost her children, has lost her sons, had nothing, is in a foreign land, is in that complete state of devastation, right? I mean, I don't know if any of us have ever experienced something like that, but the story intentionally starts out that way to kind of paint the picture of, okay, if you're in such desperate devastation, where do you turn to? And even in that sense of complete having nothing, the first chesed is to say that, well, here you have 2 daughter-in-laws. One of them goes back, but one of them, who would be like Ruth to say, no, I'm going to be with you to the very end, till death do us part. And even after that, she says, where you go, I will go. Where you lie down, I will lie down. Your God will be my God. That type of commitment. So that sense of someone like that just happening to be with Naomi is considered a sense of chesed, that it is God's faithfulness. It's not a coincidence. It's not just luck that Naomi had a daughter-in-law like Ruth. It was God's provision that Ruth was a person like that. And then they go back to Bethlehem, and it just so happened, right? As it happened, as the story teller says, that Ruth just happened to be at a relative's land that she was gleaning. She could have been in someone else's gleaning, and life would not be the same. But just so happened, and so what the story of Ruth is saying is, well, even that, wasn't that God's hand of grace kind of guiding that? And that hand of guidance is an indication of God's chesed, that even in those desperate times, God is still watching over and guiding because of God's steadfast love and compassion. It's not just because God is nice to us it's because of that steadfastness. It's not a matter of whether we deserve it or not. It's God's steadfast guidance will kind of be there for us. And then, of course, through the whole, chapter 3 and 4, the threshing floor and all, once Naomi and once Ruth and Boaz bear a child, Obed, that last paragraph that talks about how Obed, the son, is given back to Naomi is actually that is actually the main crux of the story. It's the story of Ruth is actually about the redemption of Naomi, of how Naomi goes from a state of total devastation to being completely redeemed, where the community people say to her, "Blessed is Naomi," because through all that, God has provided. And that's the story that the book of Ruth tells. All right, so what are your thoughts? It's 4:04.
I like the fact that Boaz actually went to the field to meet this foreigner, because to me, so much of our noted, when I think of the other, it's an abstract, we don't know the people. Once you actually get to know someone who's of another group, it makes a big difference. You begin to see that these are human beings rather than just whatever label we give to us. So that part of the story makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's right. That's true. It also kind of makes you, it does say something about Boaz's character, right? Mm-hmm. That he would go there, but he also, it's like, okay, who is this woman? It's not like they had like tons of, foreign people just coming in all the time to glean on the field. So, so there's this woman. It's just he kind of did some research, like who is she, and kind of got the backstory, and yes, went out to and actually made sure that she was cared for. Other thoughts? The story of Ruth.
It's the unconditional love that is given to us through the grace of God.
Mm-hmm. The other word, in the Greek word that we use for that unconditional love is agape.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's a Greek word,
right.
Agape, and we translate that as being God's unconditional love. Chesed is slightly different than, it's not really about love. It's actually about, actually, sometimes it can be translated as steadfast love. In Psalms, we have, and his love endures forever.
Mm-hmm.
Some of our Psalms have that rhythmic, and God's love endures forever. That's chesed. That's actually, it is the word chesed. So yes, I guess you could use steadfast love, but it's more than that, because it has to do with that sense, like I said, of commitment with compassion.
I think the word my kids use now is it's a God call.
It's a God call.
It's a God call. That what happened was that power of God to step in ways we don't understand, and they call it a God call.
Oh yeah, I like that. I like that. It's a God call. Yeah.
I think it might give hope to older men who haven't married or who are widowers, that there might be a Ruth and a Naomi come on your field.
Yes, right.
Even though you may have been had barriers in the past, there could be a time.
Right.
I also like the fact that so many of these characters have their murky sides. They're human. They have their, and some of the things we were looking at, how could they do that? Well, I like that because it allows you to identify with these people, because we all have our shadow sides. We're not all saints. And yet, so there's many paths to righteousness.
That's why, for me, I love reading the Bible, because the story of every single character, there's not a single character in the Bible not a single character. Okay, Jesus, but besides Jesus, right? There's not a single character in the Bible that doesn't have their issues, their quirks, their flaws, and everyone have their struggles. And for me, the Bible is a story, of people addressing or talking about the struggles of life and trying to find God in the midst of that.
I think too that the struggles, they look for God, and sometimes they don't find it.
Yeah.
But they are on a journey, or they are on a path.
Right.
As an old school teacher, it's the process.
Mhm.
And so I think the process has merit.
Exactly right. The seminary that I got my Master of Divinity from is known for a theological thinking or theology called process theology. It's controversial. Not everyone likes process theology, but there's different types of theology. There's liberation theology, feminist theology, and all kinds of other classical theologies. But process theology is a newer 20th century line of thinking of how to understand God. Bill and I were talking, maybe I need to teach a course on process theology.
Oh, definitely.
Just
Yeah.
an overview, a different way of understanding how God works in the world. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Albert.
Yeah.
Why in the Christian Bible were the books in different order? Do you know?
Why was it?
Look, for example, why is Ruth found in a different section?
Mhm. Again, I think, well, first of all, even the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible was not completely compiled until 90 AD. That is the earliest that we know of that it was in its current form, the Hebrew Bible. And so, by that time, you already had the Christian communities, small groups actually, house church. But then the Bible as we have it, the Old and New Testament wasn't fully compiled again until the 4th century. So different, there's always different lines of thinking. And so even though the Hebrew Bible would have been completely compiled by the time 4th century, the Council of Nicaea would have come about, they did make these changes because, again, like I said, some of the Christian thoughts attributed some of these writings to be more historical rather than keeping it as the Jewish or rabbinical teachings of some of these writings actually being understood as these are writings. They're not historical accounts, which I think has a really high value. For me, I was always taught in seminary, when you read the Old Testament, don't read it as, oh, this is the Old Testament and now we have the New Testament. Don't read it that way. That's just wrong. That's pretty degrading. But it's the Hebrew Bible. And the way to read the Old Testament is to read it with the ears and eyes of our Jewish brothers and sisters. And so I always, even though, the book of Job, it's before the book of Psalms in our Bible, but in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Job is after the book of Ecclesiastes in the order that we're doing the wisdom literature.
Right.
So
putting Ruth where they did in the Christian Bible made it more authoritative.
I don't
Because
think
it was history rather than writing.
it's considered more history. Now that does create an issue just so that people just read it as a historical account rather than try to look at the deeper meaning behind it to ask, okay, what is the story trying to teach us, of God's nature? So because again, you also have the other writings in the early part that's in the Christian Bible, but or the Christian Bible has like the books of Chronicles, First Chronicles, Second Chronicles, in the early part of the historical section. In the Hebrew Bible, it's actually part of the writings. So, others. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. I was worried for a minute when I first logged in and it was just Bill and me. I'm like, okay. But I'm glad that y'all came on. And I'm so sorry that I had this. Okay, now I can see you all. Thank you for joining me. I don't realize that it's being shared because again, when you share PowerPoints and Zoom, the presenter don't know what's actually being shown. So thank you for joining me. Next week, we will be looking at the story of Esther, which is also a very interesting book. The book of Ruth, what do you call it? The religious leaders, the Jewish leadership, when the Hebrew Bible was being compiled in 90 AD, they had no problems, including Ruth, because they understood that it was a writing that really taught about Chesed, God's nature. They had a hard time, including the book of Esther. There was very strong leanings to not include Esther at all in the Hebrew Bible. And the reason for that is there is no mention of God in the book of Esther. So it's a fun book. It reads like a movie. It reads like a comical movie. So when you get a chance, read through the book of Esther. There's like 10 chapters, 12 chapters. And we will be back next week, same channel, same time, at 3 o'clock on Wednesday. All right?
Okay, bye-bye.
All right,
Thank you.
blessings.